Hello, everyone, and welcome to another cover seminar. For this week, we have Jaakko Nevasto, who I always butcher your name. I'm sorry about that, Jaakko. Who is I think we know from being in and around Essex for a number of years, um, and who's going to give us talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is market failures. So with that very brief intro, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Yaakov, to do as you will.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for setting up the seminar, and thank you for coming to listen. This is I particularly like the image you posted with the invite with the guy lying on a table with the stock market going crashing behind them. Something quite poignant and suitable about that. So this work in progress material, which I haven't presented before, so if the slides are slightly disjoint, that might be the reason. But I'm going to try and share the screen again. Am I sharing now? Does
Yes.
that work? Okay, so it's getting what we want morally significant on the market failures approach to business ethics and some musings about post-capitalism. Now, hold on, why doesn't it look? Okay, so the talk is basically in three parts. First, an exposition of a debate around the so-called market failures approach. Then a sort of philosophical critique of a major premise in this debate. And then after that, I'll go into a bit of speculation under the title Metacritique. So those three parts. This is not a, despite the title, this is not a kind of traditional practical ethics paper. Rather, I'm using a debate in applied ethics to go into something we might call meta-ethics, some of the underlying assumptions. And at the very end, I will ramble on a little bit about Marx and Adorno, who everyone likes. I will answer the question, though, and I'm going to answer it head on. I think it's possibly true that getting what we want is ethically relevant, but I don't think that holds in the way the participants in the debate I cover view well-being, and I don't think it possibly holds within capitalism. So I'm kind of given the core message away already. I think that's good. So before further delay, so the market failures approach to business ethics is in some sense a very old debate. Could be cast in terms of the implicit morality of markets. So the thought here is that while we might think that the pursuing of direct self-interest nonetheless yields on the whole to a ethically recognizable endpoint and purpose, mainly efficient resource allocation. So McMahon has been commenting on this in the 80s that systemic utility as beneficence is indeed the implicit morality of the market. The market is such a thing that it has this implicit moral character. The market is beneficent in this way when it approximates efficient resource allocation. And in this way, the condition of perfect markets is a sort of a moral ideal. It's not, of course, sort of a reachable ideal, but it's a sort of thing that we strive to reach, and as it plays the role of a moral ideal. This has deep roots, of course, as people will know, at least as far as Mandeville, Burke, Smith, Hayek in the kind of nominalist empiricist tradition of in philosophy, whereby we think that the collective or aggregate outcomes of unintended, undesigned private action still can have moral significance. Private vices, public benefits. It's from Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. Now, the contemporary version of this, Joseph Heath, who was, I believe, in Essex not that long ago. So he's written a series of interventions conveniently in that collection if people are interested in market failures approach to business ethics. So I'm not assuming that anyone knows anything about this. So just briefly, So he thinks that he's somehow charting a middle ground between what is typically cast as the stakeholder and the shareholder approaches, and he's particularly has a bee under his bonnet about the stakeholder critics, who he basically thinks are anti-capitalists, too left-wing for his liking. So he's intending to confront this tendency in business ethics writing, and with arguing that we don't really need stakeholder ethics if we properly appreciate the implicit morality of markets as such. So what this means in practice is that business actors shouldn't generate or strive to benefit from what he calls market failures. Now, market failures here means, in this debate, means something like cartels, for instance, price fixing, concealing relevant information about products, or blatantly making use of negative externalities, such as outsourcing one's environmental damage without, in a sense, accounting for it, without paying for something that really ought to be accounted for in the economy. So those are market failures. So transactions where the efficiency imperatives of the market are not reached. So in that sense, the market fails. So what does that mean in sort of more technical details? Well, he thinks that basically we can flesh out that intrinsic ethical engine room with a bit of welfare economics. So he argues that the Pareto principle forms the normative core of market failures to business ethics, market failures approach, forming in the telos of market competition. And from this principle, we can get action guidance. So what is that principle? Well, in the most abstract sense, it means that when across the economy, a new allocation of resources have been introduced, by which at least somebody is better off and nobody is worse off. Now, he thinks that this structure ideally is implicit in each market exchange where we go and buy something, whether it's products or services or medium-sized dry goods. So under certain conditions, free transactions strive to be Pareto-optimal and in that sense incrementally improve the efficiency of the economy as a whole. And striving for these improvements provide the philosophical grounds for these market internal ethics, according to Heath. So, for instance, we might then think that this permits certain managerial actions that stakeholder ethicists might find problematic. For instance, laying off workers, what he calls hard budget constraints. Business managers should, according to Heath, act with moral immunity from the norms of everyday morality. And in that sense, everyday morality is substituted by the specific normative structures which arise from the market logic as such. So, in this sense, an action which may result to hardship is nonetheless permissible because it increases the increased efficiency across the market. The idea is that the increased welfare of the beneficiaries of that decision outweighs the loss of the welfare to losers, other things being equal, of course. So thereby we can bracket the moral significance of the hardship caused as everyday morality and in that sense pursue the particular morality that characterizes markets. And that is important, according to Heath, on the back of what he takes to be the benefits for the system as a whole. So this is really core to my paper, this idea of what are the benefits for the system as a whole. So as he there says, you can't really do this kind of business ethics without appreciating what justifies the system of private enterprise as a whole, systemic. So it's an argument for systemic purpose, I think. And and here he basically explicates what he means. The ultimate goal of the economy as a whole is to satisfy human needs. Demand for various goods is an expression, however imperfect, of the intensity of these needs, and the function of the price system is to channel resources toward the satisfaction of the most important of these needs. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but according to each individual's own assessment. So this is really what I think is the sort of engine room of his approach. Now, critics have suggested that there's something a bit amiss about all this, as it doesn't take into account what they call Cohen and Peterson their non-economic values. Cohen and Peterson have been writing a few papers, and there's been some back and forth with Heath as well on this. And basically, Cohen and Peterson are trying to they accept the major premise, namely that the market is beneficial in an ethical sense, but they should be bolted with some deontological constraints. Worries here, not difficult to get a handle on, I think. The market failures approach, MFA there, can't really capture the cases where we might just simply object to there being a consumer market as such, say overly addictive products, military-grade firearms, kidneys, and thinks that there are strong moral intuitions against having a market there in the first place. So then it would not really be a question of market failures, but there would be something off about having a market in the first place. So Cohen and Peterson thinks that we need this in business ethics as well. It's not enough just to have the logic of market failures. It must include normative considerations beyond the consequentialist optimization of preference satisfaction. And centrally, Cohen and Peterson argue that the preference satisfaction here should be somehow balanced off against other moral arguments. So I'm quite interested in that move. I think it's interesting but problematic. So why is it problematic? Well, I think that debate is in some sense an impasse, because then we get this sort of problem of comparative weights. Assuming that it is some kind of good to satisfy to pursue this optimal preference satisfaction, then how is it possible to compare that to other goods, other moral goods? So, for instance, if we think that the preference to purchase a child is somehow off, then how are we to compare that comparatively to the potential benefit from that to say deontological arguments from dignity? It would seem that if we appreciate the intuition, we basically reject the view that preference satisfaction has some value. If we don't balance it off, it's not a question of having a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It seems that to appreciate what Cohen and Peterson is saying, we do abandon preference satisfaction as morally relevant wholesale, and we don't really balance it off, I think. And there's further problems that this stage of a debate could be set to result to, because if we operate with this practice of comparative weights, then we might just easily regenerate the sort of standard problem of business ethics that, well, this sort of value pluralism just makes the whole enterprise of thinking business ethics in any rigorous sense a bit of a false start. In that we can't accept business agents and managers to really be engaging this kind of fine-grained moral philosophical argumentation. And in that sense, if we follow this, then we kind of reignited what is attractive about the market failures ethics in the first place, because it is very simple. It makes, according to Heath, a philosophically informed reconstruction of the norms that are already implicit in the marketplace, and that is all we need. So the debate reads an impasse, I think, and my strategy here, well, Cohen and Peterson has a rejoinder where you talk about moral blind alleys, but for brevity, I'm just going to leave that to discussion if people are interested in this particular bit more. So what I'm doing now is moving on to basically investigate the shared premise that the Heath and Cohen and Peterson all share, namely that the justification of market is ethical in that markets optimize consumer preference satisfaction. Now, this is a bit of those of you who've read some welfare economics. This is a kind of a standard story, often called preference satisfaction welfarism, where basically the intensity of preferences tracks satisfaction, and the price mechanism is an index to both. So the fundamental welfare theorem states that under certain idealized conditions, the price system guarantees a Pareto-efficient allocation of goods and services. And Heath and others here think that this is basically a way to think about ethics. So here comes the philosophical critique of this idea. So in sort of literature on needs, sort of meta-ethics on needs, it is basically an attempt to articulate a common sense distinction between needs from mere wants, desires, and whims. So typically we think that needs are such things that are indexed to harms. Non-satisfaction of a need results to harms. Might think sort of vital needs, such as for certain calorie intake, temperature, clothes, and whatnot. Preferences or wants and desires in this way of thinking don't involve harms as a consequence of non-satisfaction unless they're indexed to needs. So obviously I can have a want or a preference backed off by a need, but I can also have wants and preferences that are not really indexed to needs. And in that sense, the harm relation is what really gives need claims this normative gravitas and kind of argumentative force. So we might then think that, well, I'm gonna go back to where Heath talks about needs. Where was that? Oh, sorry about this rambling. There it is. That ultimate goal of economy is to satisfy human needs, says Heath, according to individuals' own self-assessment. So you might think that, well, okay, he's just being completely opportunistic here. He doesn't really need me. He doesn't mean needs. He just means preferences. So he's appealing to the sorry, let's go back there. He's appealing to the gravitas of the needs discourse, where in fact he just has preferences at his disposal. But it sounds more credible. It sounds more ethic-like if you say needs as opposed to if you just say preferences. So, but need claims then have a connection to welfare, and then potentially we can have an ethical theory. That seems relatively straightforward, at least in this level. Right. Why am I getting? I'm not sure if my presentation is stalled here a bit. Let's go back here. Sorry about that. So, right. It has indeed stalled a little bit. Okay, so other reasons to be interested in needs in this context is say that pharmaceutical research typically tracks consumer preferences very well, but not necessarily needs that don't register as effective demand. We also have interesting material recently coming out of the way in which Amazon has been lobbying certain very lax antitrust laws in the North American context, using the arguments from consumer preference satisfaction very effectively. Climate scientists talk about a shift from preference satisfaction to something like basic human needs, and the need problem space features prominently in the degrowth discourse. Needs beyond material opulence, as in Jackson. Preferences again. So, well, okay, say, well, what if one would say that, well, Heath clearly is just talking about preferences, and then maybe there is a meaningful sense in which, nonetheless, preferences are a kind of an index to our subjective sense of well-being, and let's just ride with preferences, is because that's what people in this debate might ultimately really mean. So maybe it's a distraction to talk about needs, despite Heath's rhetorical flares. But that raises the question of what is a preference. So we might typically distinguish between preference as having a count of prioritized reasons for something. So in this sense, I might have a preference for going to the gym rather than watching Netflix, and I might occasionally really follow through that I will go to the gym rather than watch Netflix. But I can then give reasons for so doing, why the gym is a priority, because that bolts into some conception of what it is good for me. So having prioritized reasons for something can be indexed into some arguments about harms and benefits and welfare. But the key to take away from this section is that this is not what the welfare economist means by preference, because what they have at their disposal is simply a description of choices made. So that would be a preference in the sort of revealed preference sense, as can be tracked by what people have bought, market data. So the second sense of preference, merely descriptive sense, can't contain any insights about why we have done something. It's simply a description of choices made. And in that sense, the notion of preference and the notion of need simply is collapsed into description of choices made. So, and that holds a kind of canonical position in welfare economics, and that is also the core of the market failures approach and the debate surrounding it. As for philosophers have thought for a while, it's quite problematic. Frankfurt in the 70s, where first and second order preferences. I may prefer smoking to exercise, but nonetheless prefer not to have that preference. So typically we think that human beings have preferences, of course, but we also have preferences about our preferences. So the argumentation runs on first and second order levels, but again, it's only really the first order that Heath and others can appeal to. And yeah, there's a whole host of conversation about this, and summary of which I will go through 25 minutes. So that the attempt to build a normative ethics out of gratified desires fails, according to philosophers, according to philosophical critique. Of course, there are ways in which you can have more complicated and interesting preference satisfaction accounts, but then that would mean that you would have to rely on some conditions of rationally held preferences. And of course, if you just have the Pareto artillery, you will have no such resources at your disposal. Interestingly enough, so it doesn't sound like I'm just having a go at the economists. Pareto himself didn't think that, as that block quote there demonstrates, they didn't think that the utility that he has in mind really has much to do or anything to do with the way utility works in consequentialist moral philosophical argumentation. So morphine is useful to the addict. Well, it's not useful to the addict in the ordinary sense, but it's economically useful to the addict. So it really is just that sense of very arid, abstract sense of utility that the economist has in mind. Pareto invented a separate word for that. It's called ophilimity. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But nonetheless, that hasn't stopped Heath and others and philosophers who are kind of seduced by this idea that you can outsource part of your normative artillery to the economists. Whereas Heath just simply goes defining utility really with respect to preferences of individuals. Right, so Heath, as well as his critics, defend the purposefulness of capitalist markets via this route. I don't think it works. I think it's suspect. However, a philosophical critique doesn't fully extinguish the intuition, I think, that there is something about the first personal idiosyncratic sense of one's needs, and it could be potentially relevant to welfare. And if so, then even potentially it could be morally important that we get what we want. So I'm going to now move to the third and speculative part of the work in progress, where I want to suggest that basically there's something in. I'm gonna ask the question: what would it look like if we would just read Heath naively, in a sense that it would be fine to conflate welfare, pregnant needs, and just mere preferences. That conflation that he's up to, that it wouldn't really matter. And in this sense, I'm methodologically also doing something that the early Frankfurt school likes, mainly metacritique, the thought being that philosophical conundrums have a basis in social reproduction. And I'm just going to bombard you with some Marx. So Marx on the valorization process, and here's a chunky passage. Commodities must be realized as use values before they can be realized commodities must be realized as values before they can be realized as use values. On the other hand, they must stand the test of use values before they can be realized as values. For the labor expended on them only counts insofar as it is expended in a form which is useful to others. However, only the act of exchange can prove whether that labor is useful to others and its product consequently capable of satisfying the needs of others. That's complicated. So I think that what's interesting about Marx is that he captures something that the marginalist school in economics started to articulate a little bit later. I think Marx, in a sense, agrees that under capitalism, within capitalism, whether something is really useful or whether it really is valuable is only accessible by the price mechanism. So in that sense, it's not wrong to insist upon that. But there's a catch. And the catch is that the system as a whole is directionality, and is directional in a sense that can't be captured by the marginalist economists. By that, I particularly mean Pareto and that tradition, because use values are produced by capitalists only insofar as they form the material substratum of exchange value, are the bearers of exchange value. His aim is to produce not only a use value, but a commodity. Not only use value, but value. Not only value, but surplus value. So the reveals preference satisfaction as the whole story of our preferences and needs is in fact structurally corresponding to what Marx takes as the exchange process, the inputs of human energy and effort being deemed as having value if and only if they are recognized as having met effective demand in commodity exchange as labor power. So Marx gives this antagonism between preferences and needs a conscious expression as something structurally necessary within the capitalist economy. So giving something a conscious expression seems to be an advantage. And that makes Marx interesting here. So the lack of coherent welfare dimension in Pareto's economics corresponds perhaps also to the psychology of the optimal consumer. However, I argue that this contains an unconscious utopian element. Adorno, in his characteristic style, suggests needs are conglomerates of truth and falsehood. What is true is the thought that wants the right thing. I think the suggestion there is that we can't really distinguish something like welfare-relevant needs, real needs, and just mere preferences, or even something like false need, sort of corrupt needs, addictive ones. We can't distinguish in any neat fashion which ones are which. But what would be the thought that wants the right thing is that, in some sense, to be able to do so would require one to have well-formed impulses and intuitions. So in this rather complex way, I think Adorno preserves there that sort of first personal intuition, but in as a kind of promissory note. Yeah, and as I just rambled on, the indistinguishability of true and false needs is an essential part of the present phase. So I think that there is a speculative truth content in the problematic premise, namely the preference satisfaction welfarism. And then we could ask the question that what would reproduction have to be like so that we could insist on it, as it were, naively, as it were, in a flat-footed sense. So from Marx and Adorno, we could get two obstacles. So basically, the abstraction involved in being able to meet and foster needs only via commodities, reproduction of surplus value, and ultimately capital, and the condition of scarcity and precarity. And if we look at Marx a little bit again, he does give us a philosophical blueprint where it would seem that these things are not, these two obstacles are no longer there. So within a cooperatively organized society based on common ownership, products no longer appear as value. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can peruse it. Familiar passage, perhaps. And when we're in the conditions of where springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, we get the famous the aim from the flagship message of post-capitalist society: from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Adorno, which I take to be a kind of a later day Marx in this respect, has some interesting passages about productivity in genuine undisfigured sense. And what he's saying there is that basically what we now deem to be useless, frivolous, perhaps capricious consumption has this stamp, because we still live in conditions of scarcity, and artificial scarcity, of course, but scarcity nonetheless, because most of our energy is going to generation of surplus value, which is expropriated then and consolidated in capital. So I'm going to conclude so that people have time to talk. So few thoughts. So if the systemic benefits of markets is preference satisfaction, satisfying grounds to hold on, that big image is now on top of the what I'm supposed to read. The non-compliance, I can't see that because this benefit can only be secured by presupposing a robust level of basic needs satisfaction. Would it be not the case, following Heath, that market actors should commit to securing such needs satisfaction? So a kind of an imminent critique of Heath's structure. And perhaps the utopian promise in Pareto welfarism can be formulated as a question. What is it about capitalism that prevents its realization? And perhaps the implicit morality of markets debate contains an inkling of unconscious post-capitalism where getting what we want would be an ethically worthy aim not riddled by blatant contradictions. But I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaakko. That was super interesting. I'm gonna see if we have any questions or things that people want to chat about. I have some things, but I will defer to others first. Okay, then I'll ask something. There's something interesting there about when you're talking about the sort of move or the sort of sleight of hand between needs and preferences and how those things those kind of slippages occur. Because I think that's kind of interesting. It might be interesting if you go into that a bit more. But I was also thinking, I have some friends who have been writing about post-capitalist currencies, particularly using blockchains, and they seem to be going back to the parts of Hayek, where Hayek talks about markets as basically communication medium, um, where markets are essential for, let's say, revealing preferences and needs. I was wondering if that overlaps with sort of the way you're talking about needs manifesting, or whether that's disconnected. And I feel slightly weird having mentioning Hayek, but there we go.
Yeah, that sort of blockchain conversation has been on the back of my mind for a while, and I haven't really found my way into it. So if you have any like suggestions where to look at, that would be super helpful. So I think, and Hayek reference also, I think he's thinks of himself in some sense of as what would be the right word? As developing from Hayek. I mean, Hayek, I think, has this idea that the market is a sort of iterative process, a sort of incremental self-correcting process. So that certainly features quite prominently in Heath's thought. And I don't know how the blockchain people make use of this, but that could be interesting. But I think Hayek and Heath, just more generally, are, I think, I'm not like a Hayek scholar, but my suspicion is the Hayek is more of a traditional liberal, and Heath's not. So I don't think Hayek would defend capitalist markets on a basis of them being sort of welfare promoting. I think freedom is the sort of non-negotiable value for Hayek. Is more that's my impression. So, but nonetheless, I think there is a similarity between Hayek and Heath, and that blockchain stuff is super interesting. I'll pull you up on a few references if you have anything to share.
Of course. Mate?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaakko. That was really interesting. I have a bit of a, I guess, a more basic question, which is, I wasn't quite sure what the target of your critique is. I thought initially it sounded a bit as if the target of your critique is a particular conception of business ethics that might be flawed. But then I also got the impression later on that the target of your critique is sort of the market as such, because the market makes it the case that we can't properly distinguish between needs and preferences. So I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit. In case the market as such is the target of your critique, I was wondering what your thoughts were on proposals of incorporating markets within socialist designs of society. So imagine, for example, a society that makes sure that resources are fairly distributed, that basic liberties are protected, that there's no indoctrination, no brainwashing, no sort of undue tampering with people's preferences for consumption. And that society used markets in a limited way so that resources get allocated efficiently, that sort of the price mechanism works to transmit some information from A to B in a decentralized fashion. In that kind of society, would you still be opposed to a market? Do you still think it would sort of deform people's preferences in a way that's problematic? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, I see, yeah. So I mean, yeah, maybe it was a bit I probably felt like I had to run through the important bits in order to keep so I'm basically commenting on a debate around the market failures approach, and I'm suggesting that the debate hangs on a premise that is not philosophically on solid grounds, contrary to what the participants in that debate think. But then I'm further suggesting that I'm not just happy, nonetheless, with the philosophical critique, as I put it, what the philosophers have thought about it. And I want to, in a sense, work on the intuition that this preference satisfaction welfarism has, namely the notion that maybe we need to take seriously the idea that first personal intuitions are in a way a guide to our well-being. Because it seems like there's a sort of a disjoint that on the one hand, the people that get excited about the welfare economics, and they are sort of happy to run with that very subjective notion of need satisfaction. Call it subjective and objective for the sake, so that it doesn't clog up. And then, but if you look at the philosophical literature around that, then the philosophers just tend to think that, well, this is just nonsense. That surely can't work. So I want to, in some sense, rescue something about that and do something even slightly crazier and say that, well, maybe there's an inkling in the radical tradition that also cares about that. Mainly my Marx and my Adorno. But to your so no, I'm not like opposed to the market. No, not at all. I just don't think that these particular defenses of the market, as in Heath and his commentators, I don't think these defenses work. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Timo?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? I have a few kind of rather jumbled thoughts, Jaakko. I hope they're going to be in some sense helpful. But I mean, I've been struggling with Heath's work for quite a while because I still don't understand, or I'm not entirely sure that I have fully understood him. And as I think someone said earlier, we had him as a guest at a workshop on competition and competitiveness just a few months ago at Essex, and we had a lot of time to talk, and I'm not sure that I understand him better after this or less well. I mean, one of the things that struck me there was his kind of rather interesting, like really strong insistence on this idea that competition and the adversarial relationships that are, constitutive of market relations are genuinely bad in a way, and they are outweighed by other things, but they are bad. So he comes across as a real critic of those, and nevertheless then ends up justifying them on a consequentialist ground. And that makes me kind of even more wondering about the consequentialist grounds. I mean, I guess one way in which one potentially could defend him is to wonder whether he's not doing himself a favor by making it look as if the consequentialist defense of the market is freestanding, right? So I mean, the arguments that referred to by Cohen and Peterson seems to me to be predicted on a reading of Heath that is suggesting that according to Heath, the only kind of moral considerations that we should bring to bear on markets are consequentialists. And I'm not sure that anyone is committed to that. Well, anyone should be committed to that, right? So there could be rules around what should not be for sale, for example, that could be based on deontological grounds, and they could hedge in, hem in, you could say, the kind of the scope of the market. So I think that would be possible. One of the things that is interesting in that context, and I did ask him specifically about this because it struck me so strongly reading his book, seeing his kind of, the way he toys in the book with Friedman's famous idea around, the purpose of business is it being making money and not anything else. I mean, one of the things that you never see he say, and he has confirmed that he doesn't say it because he doesn't believe it, is that there is any truck in this idea that markets could be justified by an argument from freedom, right? So he basically says this whole idea that Friedman and Hayek has, that the reason why we should protect market freedom is just that it is a particular element of human freedom to be able to make choices, to be able to associate in certain commercial ways with people. He basically says that has no freestanding value at all, right? He thinks that the market, if it can be justified, can only be justified by its outcomes in a way. And the reason why that's kind of interesting is that then he also has a further problem in the book, which is that he discusses at quite some length the theory of the second best, right, and the third best, and then he discusses something that he calls the frictionless plane analogy, which is a how does he call that? Are you familiar with that part of the book, or am I leading you somewhere where it's
so
going to
I do remember having read the frictionless plane analogy, and it's not fresh in my fingertips at the moment, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah. It's actually called the frictionless plane fallacy, and there is a reason why I bring it up, which will hopefully become apparent in about 30 seconds. But basically, the frictionless plane fallacy is to think that Pareto optimality works like a friction, like a plane.
Yeah, that's
right. So the idea is, according to Newtonian physics, if you roll something down a plane, if the plane is even and if there was no friction, then the ball would never stop. And if there is friction, the ball will stop. And how quickly it will stop depends on how much friction there is. And there is a proportionality there between the strength of the friction and the rolling of the ball. So a nearly frictionless plane will make the ball run very far. A very frictious plane will have it very short, right? And the striking insight of the kind of, the theorems of welfare economics is that this does not work the same way for Pareto optimality, right? So the argument is that if all the Pareto conditions that are unmeetable in practice were met, then we would have the outcomes that's the Pareto optimal that it states, namely you could come out at various equilibria that are Pareto optimal, but it is not the case that if they're nearly met, that then also the outcomes are nearly optimal. Because in fact, what happens is as soon as they're not fully met, the outcomes could be vastly suboptimal.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a well-known fact about the nature of welfare economics, right? And why it is that there is such a big problem between the theory and the practice of that. So given the fact that he discusses that at great lengths in the book, it becomes then unclear why he wants to put so much kind of normative pressure on the idea that the Pareto kind of optimal outcomes of market transactions are justifying the system. Because given the fact that the conditions for optimality are never going to be met, so there is actually no built-in promise that free markets actually lead to outcomes that are desirable.
Yeah.
So there is a genuine tension in the book, it seems to me, between those two claims. And the reason why I'm mentioning this now in relationship to freedom is that it might be that if he had an argument from freedom, that would be less of a problem. Right, so he could say, Jaakko, you have given us all those arguments for why people's self-understanding of their own needs or preferences is problematic, and people are deceived about them. They're not having well-behaved preference structures, and there are all kinds of philosophical problems with figuring out how strong the objective value really is of what we take subjectively to be our needs or preferences. But the truth is, there is a particular type of satisfaction to be had by human beings if they do get what they want, even if what they want is wrong. And that is enough, right? So that would be an argument that I think he could make. And I think in a way you say something that is not completely wrong, completely unrelated to that, right? But the point is that he can't say that because he doesn't think that there is an intrinsically valuable aspect of freedom and choice. So that strikes me as being a really kind of weird implication of his theory. So
Yeah.
that was very rumbly.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's incredibly helpful, and you reminded me some bits of the book that I read a while ago, and somehow managed to not really reconnect. But yeah, I think this kind of goes back a little bit to the earlier, but yeah, the Hayek difference, because clearly for Hayek, it is freedom where it lands, and I guess for like quite a lot of traditional liberals, that they're interested in the kind of sanctity of the first person, or because they're worried about paternalism in a kind of political sense.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you say, yeah. So this came out in conversations with him, that he really doesn't think that freedom has much of a or any weight in the justificatory project.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I assume he is a liberal, so he believes in some other liberal rights and freedom rights independently of it, but it's not as if the market specifically is justified by its contribution to freedom.
Yeah.
He does not believe that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he has this sort of, I mean, you said a lot of really interesting things, and I'm sort of struggling to where do I. So yeah, so the first thing you said is that you think that the Cohen and Peterson objection, or my presentation of it, is something that he can wriggle out of quite easily. So that it wouldn't be difficult for Heath to concede that, yeah, we need some deontological constraints in the sort of the setup, and then once they're in place, then we let the market sort of run its business. Right?
Yeah.
So this is what I struggle a little bit, because I think that, I mean, that is correct, but I think that, but Heath wants to say something to business practitioners, and he wants to say that they should embody some of these principles in their everyday activity, and all of that can be cashed out in the market failures way. So it's because we're only really talking about beyond compliance norms, whereas I think Cohen and Peterson want to say that these deontological constraints should in a sense be operating on the back as non-compliance intuitions in the minds of business actors, business managers. I thought that that's where they kind of disagree. So it would be right to say that, okay, we have deontological principles, and they're, you know, they're made into rules that must be followed, legal rules. But where there's the kind of non-compliance set of obligations, he thinks do have to really just be the market failures. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I think there is a difference between compliance to rules that are constitutive of a specific market setup, as he understands it, as a staged competition, and kind of thinking that there are other moral rules in the markets that derive from common sense morality. So I think what Heath is very keen on stressing, and I think that's kind of in a way, as you laid it out, the point of the book, right, is to argue against a certain idea about what he considers to be extra economic values that are brought to bear on business ethics, for example, in the stakeholders approach. But when it comes to considering the market as, and this is his favorite phrase, right, as a staged competition, where the idea basically is that we choose our market setup in a way in order to bring about social goods and use the ability for individual market participants to make profits as incentives for them to create goods that we socially want, right? So if you think about it as in that way, then it seems to me fairly trivial that when we set up that market, we can bring to bear pre-existing moral considerations in what we want to exclude from it, for example. Right? So I don't think that is not in line with what he thinks. I mean, so it's the market constitution, the market constitutive rules are not hindrances on freedom, but interferences in the market post-constitution are. And this is exactly also
Yeah.
what Hayek thinks, right? Hayek says more or less exactly the same thing in the Constitution of Liberty.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm happy to go along with part of that. In a way, the debate between how credible Cohen and Peterson are as commentators of Heath doesn't really matter all that much to me, because I'm interested in the shared premise, which they do absolutely share.
Yeah.
So that's fine, but that's helpful. Thank you. So probably should make a less meal out of that debate, because it's kind of maybe distracting from the message a little bit. But yeah, I'll definitely. I mean, if others want to say something, but that what you made how you traced the difference between two kinds of liberalism, as I take it, that's the classical one that is interested in freedom, and the one that Heath has that seems to run without. That's really helpful, and the second and third best problem that he does talk about in the book. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Sorry. Well, I guess do you want to call it a good point to pause there, Jaakko? Is that okay?
Sure. If
Well, let me just